And welcome back, everyone, to our third panel, which is on blue carbon. Lovely to see our panelists who have joined us. So on this panel, we have Chris Tuckett, who's the Director of Programmes at the Marine Conservation Society, which is a leading UK-wide community of ocean lovers who work with communities, businesses and governments to defend habitats and species. Chris formerly held senior roles at the Environment Agency and has over 20 years' experience of environmental protection. After Chris, we have Anna Quiros, who's a senior benthic ecologist at, this is a very well qualified panel, a senior benthic ecologist at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Anna is an internationally recognised expert on seaweed, blue carbon and climate change ecology, and is working specifically to manage ocean habitats, building on her extensive track record in the development of nature-based solutions for ocean management. Anna is also jointly affiliated with North Devon's very own North Devon Biosphere. And our final speaker today is Lucy Woodall, who's the Associate Professor in the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford. And Lucy's research focuses on the impact of humans on marine environments, and she has vast experience working on deep sea and coastal systems, including in the field. Lucy is also local to Devon and so knows our unique environment here very well, and is also a marvellous teacher because she got me up to speed on blue carbon ahead of the blue carbon debate in Westminster, so I was very grateful. So I'm going to hand over to Chris for her opening comments first. Thank you all.
Thank you, Selene, and marvellous to be here. I better just start by saying what blue carbon is. Those of you out there might know this very well, but let's cover that to begin with, and then Lucy and Anna will no doubt put me right and add to that because they'll know way more about this than I do. Basically, blue carbon are the habitats in the marine environment that are able to either capture or sequester carbon. So they'll take carbon in, lock it down, hold it. The main habitats that we're talking about, as far as blue carbon goes, are at the coast, so salt marsh. Then as you go into the water, seagrass, potentially other sorts of seaweeds, and I'm sure Anna will cover some of that. And then as you go out into the deeper sea, it's sediments. So sediments tend to hold carbon. They don't necessarily pull it in, but they will hold it. So those various environments are really important from the point of view of bringing in carbon, sequestering it, but also so are the animals within the sea, be that fish, cetaceans, whales, plants, algae, those sorts of things, all really important in terms of capturing carbon. This morning we've talked and mentioned a bit around trees and peat bogs, those sorts of things, the terrestrial equivalents. Actually, what I've just talked about really are the equivalents for the marine environment. They can do the same job. For the UK, our sea shelves, so those are areas that are up to 200 metres deep, the seabed, there's 500,000 kilometres squared of that, and it can hold 50 million more tonnes of carbon than UK forests. So those shelf sediments, the deep seas, really important when you compare that to UK forests and what we have on land. And some of those habitats that I've just talked about, it's been estimated how much they actually pull in and capture and sequester. Somewhere between 10.5 and 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year is pulled in and sequestered by our blue carbon habitats. For a comparison, at 10 to 60, trees on land sequester around 28 million tonnes of carbon per year. So it's in the same kind of range. And that's got a value to it. Every tonne of carbon has a value, somewhere between 742 million and 4.3 billion. It's a big range because the science on this is developing. So essentially, what we're saying is look after those habitats, expand those habitats. In doing that, we will be looking after our carbon and capturing more carbon. In order for that to happen, it needs to be official. We've heard quite a bit about nationally determined contributions today. Blue carbon needs to be within the nationally determined contributions for the UK. It's not properly at the moment. Things need to be done in order for that to happen. But we think for blue carbon to be included. There's a win-win, great from a carbon point of view, as I've already just said, but also great from a biodiversity point of view. At the moment, UK seas, only 11 out of 15 indicators of UK seas are passing. Yeah, 11 out of 15 are failing. That's really important. 4 are passing. Our seas are in very poor health. And so if we look after our seas from a carbon point of view, we will also be looking after them from a biodiversity point of view. And as Lord Devon said earlier, there are real win-wins within this. I'm going to close there because I'm sure there will be lots of questions and others that want to ask. We've done a report at Marine Conservation Society about blue carbon. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well, but I'll stop there for now.
Fabulous, thank you. It's such an exciting area. And so I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me this morning. And just touching on the previous session about education, how wonderful to have 3 scientists, women, talking about blue carbon today. So we've done our job here. So I'm a scientist. I work primarily on the areas of developing scientific knowledge and tools to support climate change mitigation. So that means curbing the causes of climate change, as well as adaptation to climate change in ocean management. So that's addressing the impacts of climate change on the marine environment. And when we talk about this, and specifically about blue carbon habitats that Chris has so eloquently introduced just now, we talk about planning, and that means allocating areas of the coast and the ocean to the protection and conservation of these habitats. Now, Chris mentioned seagrass, salt marsh mangrove. These are sort of the widely recognized habitats that we link to the blue carbon service. So the habitats that sequester carbon away from the climate system and therefore that help to regulate our global climate. But there are other components of the ocean that contribute to this capability on a global scale. So for instance, if we were to think about the seabed that Chris also mentioned, and we compare the size of that to the size of the more traditional blue carbon habitats, it is actually 130 times more extensive. So there's huge potential in the oceans to support this very important mission we have at the moment, which is to curb climate change. Now, conserving these habitats, and when we talk about climate change mitigation, we talk about enhancing blue carbon. That means expanding the areas that we have in the ocean that conserve these habitats and their restoration. That means that we have to deal with other people that use the ocean, and the ocean is actually packed with people through fisheries, other extractive uses of the seabed, like mining, shipping, all sorts of activities. So allocating space to these habitats and protecting them so that they can do this service that they do for us is actually quite a complicated process. So a lot of my work, for instance, with locally with the North Devon UNESCO Biosphere, and Andy, who was here in the panel earlier, has been to understand the benefits that these habitats provide to people, so that we can support those consultations, those public engagements that allow us to have the buy-in to have the conservation of these habitats. And that means understanding that these habits, alongside with carbon sequestration, also provide habitat for species that we want to fish, that we want to eat, and also the ones that we want to look at. And those benefits have broader impacts on the local economy. So some of the work that we are doing currently with Andy, with the Biosphere in North Devon, are about producing those economic valuations linked to these habitats, so that we can then engage with the public and with local government more clearly about the benefits that derive from added revenue, added employment that these blue carbon habitats provide. So that's really important, because that's a language that people understand. Another side of that is that protecting these habitats means that we also need to account for the impacts of climate change on them. So unfortunately, and despite our great efforts to limit emissions, this is the amount of greenhouse gases that we already have in the atmosphere mean that in the next couple of decades, there are already climate impacts that are locked into our climate system. And that means that protecting effectively these habitats means that we need to understand what those changes are and have the tools to predict where those conservation mechanisms for blue carbon are going to be most effective, how we can adapt to those conservation mechanisms. So some of the work that we're doing here in the UNESCO Biosphere in North Devon are to create the tools to have that predictive capability, so that we can put that conservation and those restoration effects where they are most needed and where they'll be most effective, most climate resilient. And in this way, with the benefits that these habitats bring in terms of carbon sequestration, but also to the local economy. We hope to be doing good use of public funds that we need to do this type of work, and also to bring the most benefit possible to the local economy. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. And handing over finally to Lucy.
Oh, hello, everyone. My pleasure to be here. And I probably got the worst job, right? Trying to introduce our area right at the end after two amazing speakers already. I did have a slide prepared, so maybe I could either share my screen or that slide can be projected for me. But while that's going on, I just wanted to share that I love the ocean, whether that's in the tropics or down in the cold Antarctica. Whether it's a stormy sea or beautiful, flat, calm, mirror-like ocean, whether I'm playing on it or whether I'm working in it. And for me, this passion about the ocean and our wonderful coastline has really come from me learning about the world through the eyes of the little creatures that live in the rock pools around the Devon coast. Learning about life, but then also learning about the communities and the importance of the heritage of ocean communities, especially to some of our smaller locations in and around Devon and Cornwall. So what do I do now? I work at the University of Oxford. I'm also principal scientist for an NGO called Nekton. And together our work really explores the patterns of life that are in the ocean, and I'm particularly interested in the bits of the ocean that I can that others people maybe don't see so much, and looking at the impacts of humans on those parts of our planet. Because I'm in an amazingly privileged position that often the bits of the planet that I see, no human has ever seen before. And I am just going to let that sit with you for a few moments, because we often think now that our world is totally explored and totally altered by us as humans. But indeed, that's not the case in our oceans. And we have to take active measures now to make sure that those areas that still are little damaged still continue to do that, because of what Chris and Anna has already said, you know, the value of the biodiversity, the value of our ecosystems is incredibly important to all of us, even if we never go down to the coast and see the ocean. Our weather, our nutrients, the way that the UK weather functions even is totally down to the waters that surround it. So I've just been told I've got screen sharing, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Okay, here we go. Escape from there. Great, thank you so much. So I just wanted to share with you today this little diagram that I created. Because Chris, what I really loved is that you included deep sea sediment. And often when we talk about blue carbon, people just don't think about that. They can say, oh, seagrass is great because it pulls in carbon. Maybe mangroves in the tropics are really awesome. But we don't think about where does the carbon go once it's in that little that plant. So that's what I've tried to do here. I've tried to show you that on land, we get carbon dioxide that is pulled out of the air into our trees, and in the water around the UK coastline, then that indeed is the same with our seagrass friends. You've already given us some really powerful numbers to share that. But of course, those seagrass blades do die off, and they will descend down onto the continental shelf and down even further, which is the sort of those little pale shapes there. And then they do get incorporated in the sediment. Of course, many of them just don't have that direct pathway down into the ocean. They're eaten by some of our little zooplankton, depicted here, and those zooplankton move up and down depending whether it's night or day, and them in turn are eaten by some of our fish, and maybe those fish are eaten by some of those large predators that are either on the sea floor or in the water column itself. And of course, they then descend onto the seabed, and you can see the little fish skeleton there as well. And really what I want you to take away from this diagram is actually it's a really complex process. A lot of life is still in the ocean, and those complex food webs are integral to this carbon storage and the carbon cycling. And in fact, when we disrupt that, then it could be any form of activity. And I've just depicted that with a little boat up here, but it's not necessarily just from fishes. But when that's disturbed, then all of the carbon stored in the sediment gets redistributed into the water column, and then that can come back out into the atmosphere. That redistributed and often remineralized carbon can then cause some of the other consequences of things like climate change, such as acidification in the oceans as well. So really, as I said, all I want you to get from this, it's closely tied, it's very complex, and for us to be able to predict what is going to happen in the future, we really need to understand what's happening. So Anna's really awesome work, really trying to get to those complexities is really important so that we have a good idea what we need to protect now to allow us in the future and future generations to really thrive. So I hope just in this short talk, I've been able to share both my passion, but also the fact that the deep sea is not remote, and it's not something that us as humans, maybe we don't see, shouldn't be concerned about, because it's absolutely vital to the way that we live our lives every day. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. That was fabulous. It's such an exciting area of science. And so we've got some questions coming in, and thank you, Anna, for answering live on there as well. And so Andy Clee has asked, what do you see as the main obstacles to protecting and expanding protected areas in the ocean, both in the UK and globally? And how do we overcome these? So please wave violently at me if you'd like to come in on that one. Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. I think it's not just, well, not necessarily about protection or designation, as it were. So for England, 38% of our seas are designated as marine protected areas of one sort or another. So, you know, you've got an area of the sea that is supposed to be looked after. The real problem is that it's not looked after. So it's designated, should be, but the management measures aren't in place. So that, I think, around the UK is a big problem. I think actually the government's done a really good job at designating, but getting around to actually putting management in place is something else. And the barrier to that, I think, has partly been actually political and around our membership of the EU. So in leaving the EU, we have now got control of our offshore waters. So those that are 12 nautical miles out to as far as 200 nautical miles. We've got full control of those now. So we can put measures in place at those. And when you talk about blue carbon, those are some quite big areas. Looking after the seabed in those habitats right now would be really good. And we can do it. Some consultation has started on that. We want to see some more. There are around 70 of those offshore MPAs, and that can happen really quickly. Inshore, I think it is more difficult, and it needs to be done in consultation. And there are more stakeholders, and we need to have those discussions locally about the environment, about how it's being used, about the best way of creating those win-wins that we keep talking about. And that takes more time. But I think there are some really quick wins right now that we can do. As far as overseas goes, again, it has to be in consultation with the stakeholders, particularly where it's inshore. We work in the Caribbean a bit, UK overseas territories, and they're really, really important to make sure that you are talking to the local community about their marine environment, getting that appreciation for it, and getting the understanding of the need to look after it and the insight as to how it's done.
Thank you, Chris. Lucy, Anna, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Is it Lucy or Anna? Sorry, I missed that.
Go on, over to you, Anna.
Sorry. That was really a good feedback from Chris. Thank you. About sort of the challenges of actually implementing effective marine conservation. I would just add a link to something that Lord Devon actually said earlier, which is about speaking language that people understand. So when we talk about allocating space to conservation and to restoration, it's always about trade-offs. So in the UK, we have a very specific regulatory framework, which are our marine spatial plans, and that's a public process that leads to those plans, and it requires engagement with all the users of a specific area affected by a plan. So that might be your fishing sector, shipping, ports, harbors, all sorts of things. And in those consultations, especially when we talk about changes in the allocation of the uses of who is allowed to access an area of the seabed, that requires that the reason for which you are changing that use is made clear to the people that are affected by that planning process. So one of the things we've been trying to do in the UK, and this is actually funded through the government's Strategic Priority Fund program called the Sustainable Management of Marine Resources, is try to change the way that consultation happens in the UK by providing information that people affected by plans understand. And this is what I was saying earlier about the sort of the economic value of protected areas. So it's about making those analyses that link those, in this case, for instance, the value of carbon sequestration as a service that we benefit from, to something that is more tangible to people affected by these plans, like how does that affect the revenue of the fishing sector or the employment of transformative industries linked to the fishing sector. And so it's by demonstrating that value that is not just biological and natural, but also economic, that we can perhaps create better buy-in to have more effective or more stringent, perhaps, conservation designation in the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Lucy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to agree with both of those. Really well said. I think in summary, I would say that conservation protection needs to be just. So the only way that is possible is really listening and having an appropriate dialogue in multiple different sectors, because this is such a complex and multi-layered conversation. And of course, for us to both protect and manage the ocean, which we're all passionate about, actually that means changes to human behavior. So if we're not listening to our humans, then we cannot do anything.
Thank you. And that leads in quite nicely to a question I've got here from Chris Jones from the Beaver Trust. And he asks, what are the most important things we can do on land to improve seawater quality, and who, if anyone, is responsible for coastal water quality, and what strategies need to be adopted for improvement? Who'd like to go first?
I can take that one.
Thanks,
I go first every time, but I can't. This is going back to my old job. Okay, so basically North Devon, I'll go back to when I worked at the Environment Agency. North Devon, I know, has got a huge catchments. And I mean, this is absolutely a thing that anything that happens on land potentially can end up in the sea. We talked a bit this morning about the connectedness and the need for connection. Absolutely, the need for connection between the different parts of our environment is really important. So it's a really good question. Selene, you talked about the amount of agriculture, cows. Yeah, it's a problem. You can't deny it's a problem. Agricultural runoff is. There is still a problem with sewage treatment works and combined sewer overflows and all of those sorts of things. It's made progress. It's made quite a lot of progress, and bathing water quality has got better over the last sort of 20, 25 years, but it seems to be stagnating a bit at the moment. So I think more does need to be done on the agriculture side of things to try and prevent the runoff, to look at where it's done, how it's done, how much nutrient is used, and how much nutrient is really needed to try and minimize the runoff, but maximize the crop and the grass, whatever you're getting, really looking at that and looking at it in some detail. Also, I mean, coming back, we were talking earlier about plastics and those sorts of things. Absolutely looking at that, looking at what's going on upstream, what's going to get into a river and end up out on the beach. I'm really trying to minimize that. And that could be from industry, things like this, tiny little microparticles and microplastics like nurdles. Also things like our own washing machines. So when you wash your clothes, if you've got synthetic clothes, synthetic fibers, those can end up in the drainage system, end up in the watercourse. They don't get taken out through the wastewater system necessarily. They end up ultimately in the sea. But what you can do is have a filter on your washing machine, which prevents that problem. There are some real practical things that can be done. Earlier this morning, we were talking about circular economy approaches. That is absolutely vital. We need, first of all, to think about, is this product needed? What happens to something at the end of its life? Is it just discarded? Can it be recycled? Can it be reused? Is it needed in the first place? And really look at what we call the waste hierarchy of reduce, reuse, recycle, so on. But yeah, coming back to bathing water quality, absolutely looking at agriculture, looking at combined sewer overflows, looking at plastics, circular economy approaches. That in a nutshell, as I say, what's needed.
Thank you, Chris. Anna, Lucy, do you have anything to add, either of you? No? Okay, moving on. I've got a question from George Curry, who asks, what does the panel see as the main tensions between blue carbon development and the traditional North Devon coastal economies, such as dredging for scallops, and how can these tensions be resolved? Anna.
I can try. Far from me to pretend I have a full understanding of those tensions. I think those are tensions that I guess Elaine will be much more aware of, and Andy as the director of the biosphere. I think what we can do as a scientist, what I can do to help resolve that tension is to demonstrate the benefits that these blue carbon habitats bring to that fishery. So for instance, seagrass particularly, and also seaweed are very important nursery habitat for the species that we harvest commercially. So for instance, the larvae of these animals, of scallops as well as fish, like these areas because they provide a physical protection from predators. And so these habitats actually have a positive effect on those fisheries. So this is a typical non-paradox that appears in the literature and in public discourse, this view that conservation needs to be seen as something against blue growth, against economic activities that rely on the ocean, like fisheries. And actually that's a non-paradox, because as in the case of blue carbon habitats like seagrass, marine conservation tends to have a positive effect on the sustainability of these species that we like to harvest. So in my opinion, the resolution of those conflicts is about making that information much more clearly available to those sectors, and to see that in some instances there might be cases where in fact you have to designate a no-take area, and in fact you have to limit dredging in specific areas if you want to protect a particular seabed feature, but that in general conservation needs not to be seen as something that acts against the growth of the fishing sector and the activity of the fishing sector. Quite the contrary, in fact, it tends to have quite positive effects, and there's plenty of evidence to that, as I'm sure Lucy and Chris would be able to demonstrate.
Thanks, Anna. And Lucy.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I just wanted to add, I think it's really important that as specialists and decision makers, we don't fall in the trap of thinking there's this knowledge deficit. And that can sometimes happen when we think, oh, they don't know something. If they knew what I knew, then they would agree with me, right? And I think that there's always a real challenge. And that's why a two-way or multi-way dialogue when we are working with stakeholders is really important. So trying to come up with what is that common goal? What do we want to see in our ocean in 10 years' time? And how collectively can we come up with those solutions? Because they're only going to work if they are a collective and agreed way. Because actually, you know, as we all know, even if things are really well legislated for, there's always going to be some little way round, and somebody's not going to be happy, and then something else changes. So it really has to be done under a consensus, understanding that we've all got to share a lot of information, but that knowledge deficit is not just a one-way aspect, it's very much around communication.
Thanks, Lucy. Chris, did you have anything to add?
I'm going to be blunt about scallop dredging and dredging in general. It stirs up the seabed. From a blue carbon point of view, it's a bad thing. So if you're in areas which either should be protected because of the seabed or because of features within them, then really dredging shouldn't be happening. And I know that actually there is an area around North Devon where there's a bylaw in place which stops that, which is great. But that's not widespread. Again, as I mentioned about around our marine protected areas at the moment, only 4% of them are protected from dredging. So I think it's the most contentious area, dredging in the round. Fishing is difficult. Dredging particularly is contentious, but I think there are alternatives. And I think one thing that's really needed for the fishing industry is help with innovation and investment to innovate and to have different sorts of techniques, different ways of gathering, more precision in how and where they fish. And when we talk about blue carbon, it does have a price, it does have a value. Really looking at the economics of this and how, where money is coming into the system, perhaps how it can be used to help those parts of the economy that might suffer as a result, including fishing. So where can the investment come to help the fishing industry to innovate? I think that's a very important area. So yes, we want blue carbon habitat, but we also want sustainable fish and sustainable fishing. Absolutely not anti-fishing, but let's look at how we can do it in the right way and modernise.
Thank you very much, Chris. And so last weekend, DEFRA did announce the first part of the 100 million funding, which is all to do with actually encouraging scientific development within the fishing industry. So we are quietly in the background, hopefully supporting our fishermen to move those things forward. So a question came in from Joan Stribbling in the chat, and she says, does it make sense then not to encourage large tourist liners to our shores? Which I thought was a very interesting question. Any takers? Nobody wants to. We don't mind stopping a bit of dredging, but we're not sure about tourist liners.
Depends what they do on the way, I think, is the answer. I mean, obviously, the bigger the vessel, the bigger the risk. It depends where it's going, what impact it's having on the way. Yeah, I think there are risks with that. Certainly, I mentioned we do some work over in the Caribbean. It's a big issue and big problem there. So I think the answer to that is whatever sort of development takes place, including bringing in big tourist vessels, it has to be properly assessed, properly monitored to know what impact it will have. And that is another area where I think we need to do some more monitoring to know what damage will be caused. Because, as Lucy said, actually, that's a major thing with the marine environment. A lot of it we don't know. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what we've got. So if you're going to bring in a great big tourist vessel, lovely, but you need to know what it's going to do.
Yeah. Oh, Anna, a virtual hand.
Indeed, Chris is absolutely right. So I can't say I have experience in this in the UK, but some of the work we do in Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam, and also in a UNESCO Marine Biosphere Reserve, which is a Coo Lao Cham Marine Biosphere Reserve, like the one in North Devon, is about that. And so it's a very small island off the central coast of Vietnam, and it's a very attractive island. They have very rich coral reefs and other types of marine habitats that people want to see. And in that case, it's these huge liners come with more people than actually inhabit and live on the island. So this comes with great problems, because these people come because they want to dive, they want to experience nature there, which is really beautiful, very much like our nature here in Devon. And so it's essential, what Chris just said is absolutely crucial, is what are those people going to do? Obviously, we don't want to reject the benefits that our natural environment brings to the local economy that people might want to visit and see, but we just need to ensure that what they're coming to do is actually sustainable and in light of all the other aims that we have for the region. So we need the economy, we need to support people, but we need to make sure we're doing it right.
Thanks, Anna. Lucy.
Yeah, I agree with both of those aspects. We need to know more, but we need to evaluate it in a whole. And I think, that it's always this challenge, right, between rights and responsibilities. When we go into a marine environment, often that is for exploitation. And we've been exploiting the marine environment because it's been out of sight and out of mind for a very long time. And now some of these things are coming back, and we're being able to see much clearer from some of the technologies, maybe just some experts working in those areas, actually what damage is being caused by some of our activities. So we do need to carefully evaluate these things, and to slight changes in behaviors. We think about, something very simple. I know using mooring buoys versus anchoring. That means a vessel is there, right? Still a vessel there, but those two different activities of the way that the vessel stays in location have really different environmental impacts. So let's be creative. We are innovative, all of us, and that innovation can happen best when we sort of talk with colleagues from across different fields. So I think the onus is on us to make sure that we evaluate, but also really think outside the box from where the solutions lie.
Thanks, Lucy. I think it's been a message that's come through that is about making sure we're all moving through this together and bringing people with us on that journey. So Adrian Bryant's asked a lovely question. So we have a large estuary here draining into the sea in North Devon with a variety of beaches from sand through rock. What should be happening right now to protect these habitats, and what can people living in North Devon do? Oh, Lucy.
Okay, so I'm going to just start something really quick. And the first thing I think is each of us can really value that. We can ask ourselves, what do those ecosystems, those beaches, those cliffs mean to us? And what can we each do in our individual lives? Because action and the protection and sustainability for future generations and their prosperity really comes from all levels down. So it comes all the way from government, through industries, through communities, and then through individuals. So as individuals, we can both value what's out there, be curious and be inquisitive. And that's a really good place to start. And I think, my other colleagues on this call will be able to have really specifics, but I think that's a really good place. Be curious.
Thanks, Lucy. Chris, did you want to come in?
You can buy sustainable seafood, and I can tell you how. We've got our own, MCS has got our own Good Fish Guide. I'm doing shameless plugs today, but I'll put a link to it in the chat. Buy locally, buy sustainably. Yes, seafood, absolutely. You can buy sustainable seafood. And I think that's going back to the whole scallop dredging thing, that's part of the problem. Our fisheries industry really struggled through Brexit and through COVID to actually get their product to market. But we've got wonderful products around our coast, wonderful seafood, and actually some of it is quite low carbon. So look locally at what's available, buy sustainably when it comes to your seafood. And yeah, actually I'd completely back what Lucy said. Look at the environment you have. Think about what you do in your everyday life, what you put down the sink, flush wherever. Yeah, look at what you're doing, what you're buying, think about it, look at where the products are coming from, think about your own life and that connectivity to your environment and ultimately to the marine environment as well. Thanks,
Chris. And Anna, did you have anything to add?
I can add small comments just from day-to-day common sense about how we use these habitats, which actually has an additive effect on them. And so simple things like sticking to marked paths instead of walking around, when you're around the dune system or near the coast, make sure you stick to that path, because it doesn't seem like much if you just walk away a little bit, but actually all of us walking away from that path actually has a huge effect on these ecosystems, and that we want to avoid. It leads to coastal erosion, and when we're on the beach, simply just leave it as you found it. Make sure you take your rubbish with you. I'm still so disheartened when I see people, it's such a simple message, take your rubbish with you, but I still see it every day when I go to the beach, and I know it's lovely to see, you know, the beach collections that were being spoken about in one of the earlier panels, and how children and young people are so engaged with this. So it's just simply having that thought that when you go to the coast, when you go to the beach, think about it, how you found it, and try to leave it that way. It's really common sense, and I hate to repeat it, but I think it's important to remember nevertheless.
Yeah, fantastic. And for those of you who haven't found it yet, the Devon and Cornwall Fish Company has opened up during lockdown over at Appledore, and a lot of that comes straight in off their boats. So do check out the link. I'm hoping Chris has popped in about from the Marine Conservation Society Good Fish, because it is something that we can all do something slightly differently to help there. So I think it's probably going to be our last question, but this one's from Austin Phil, and he said, what concerns are there regarding the expansion of offshore wind farms, and also I'd add on to that floating offshore wind? Lots of Anna, straight in.
Interesting. I've been having a lot of contact with the offshore wind industry. It's a really important technology, as you know, in the context of what we're talking about today, which is the COP, and it's about harvesting, you know, renewable energy. So it's a really important part of the solution about the decarbonization of our energy systems globally. The UK has huge resources. And so it's one of the areas, you know, our shelves and our seas are one of the areas where this industry is growing fastest around the world. And it's a really important aspect that we need to be positive about, because it has a very positive effect on climate change. With regards to environmental effects, there's plenty of evidence in the community. We know some of that not all species interact positively with these structures, but it really depends on the specifics of the structure that we're talking about. It depends on the density, or so how many turbines do we have in the wind farm. So what I would say is that we have a very good knowledge base from which this industry is growing in the UK. We know very well the impacts that it has. We are aware and very mindful through our international collaborations in the UK and through research done in the UK about where are the gaps in our knowledge with regards to environmental impacts, and that it's a growing area of research. So I'm very confident that, given also the regulatory landscape of the UK and how this is happening, that it will happen in a sustainable manner, and that there are negative effects, as there always are, but that I think we need to think about this broadly, and the trade-offs that we gain from decarbonizing our economy, and the massive impact that has on our climate system, and that is something that affects everyone.
Thanks, Anna. Chris?
Yeah, I agree with what Anna said. I think all this is a difficult one, because climate change, yes, we talked about fishing and various other pressures for the marine environment. Climate change in itself is actually the biggest pressure to our seas and marine environment in the round. And yes, nature-based solutions will be great, but we do need to decarbonize. We do need to cut down emissions. So offshore wind is a really, really important part in that. But no doubt it is going to create some damage. It needs to be done in the right places, and it's not just about the turbines themselves. They can have a big impact on seabirds potentially, but it's also about the cabling, where that cabling comes in, because that all gets reinforced and alters the seabed again, which is a problem. But there are ways to do this, to try to minimize the impact, minimize the footprint, put the cabling through the same lines. You mentioned tethering turbines as well, Selene. That's quite an interesting one, because then of course you're not going into the seabed itself, if you can just tether the wind turbine. So I think it's something that needs to be there. There's a lot happening in the North Sea. There's also going to be a lot around the sort of Celtic Sea and around Wales. More and more expansion. I think it is needed, but it's got to be done very cautiously. Back to that point about having the knowledge of where you're putting it and what impact it is going to have. There's some evidence to say that where you've got offshore wind and turbines, actually the biodiversity around it can improve, and they can almost act as kind of offshore reefs. I wouldn't want to go too far with that, but there may be some pluses as well. And also in those areas, sometimes it's difficult to actually fish in those areas, so they can end up as being sort of what we call no-take zones, which again can be a positive thing. But we've got to weigh it up really carefully, do the marine planning really carefully to know where it goes, as far as we can, what impact it's going to have. but we do need offshore wind.
Thanks, Chris. Lucy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think just one point here, this really comes back to complexity, right? If we want power, if we want electricity, we have to find ways of generating it. And there is always going to be these trade-offs. And we need to really think about what's our suite of solutions. And that there's not going to be one right answer for everybody. We're all individuals, we're all individual communities with individual needs. So I think that, again, for me, just the most powerful thing is let's listen to each other and really hear what all of the stakeholders are saying. And then together we can come up with solutions that are going to work the best for us now, but critically for future generations as well.
Thank you. And that's a really lovely note to finish this session on. So I can't thank you ladies enough. It has been an absolute privilege to have you on this panel today. It's such an interesting area. And so please stay in touch and don't ever hesitate to let me know if something's going wrong, either here locally in North Devon or more widely, as I do chair the all-party parliamentary group for the Celtic Sea, amongst other things at Westminster. So I think it's been an absolutely incredible morning. Thank you to all of our speakers in all of our panels and to Lord Devon for joining us from the car. And it's my team for setting this up and CEN for all their help. But I think the key message that I've taken out of this is the interconnectivity of all of this, and that, as our professor said earlier, we already live in this environment. It's not something external to us. We are part of this, we are part of the problem, and we are all potentially part of the solution. And that actually but the only way we're going to get there is working together. It's not throwing things across the House of Commons or at each other. But I really do think it's been an incredible morning. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to everyone in North Devon that's listening in. And I hope that we can do something again similar. And the key parts that we've taken out from today, we will make sure are fed back into ministers. And that's very much what I see my role in this as doing, is taking North Devon's voice back to Westminster. And in this really critical area where we can actually here in North Devon do so much, particularly blue carbon. We're very fortunate to have so much of it right on our doorsteps, and I hope we can actually do more to work to actually provide solutions moving forward. So thank you everybody, and I hope that everyone in North Devon has a lovely Saturday, and everyone further afield as well. So thank you all so much for coming, and please enjoy your weekend and the rest of this great big green week that has just kicked off today. Thank you everybody, and see you all soon.